Good evening, everybody. Now, I first met my guest today when this summer we visited his home in Malta, and he dazzled us with his knowledge, insights, and recollections gathered over a lifetime of inquiry and achievement. His cornerstone is architecture, for which he has been showered with awards and honors too numerous to mention here. But he is also an accomplished poet, artist, photographer, sculptor, and writer. He is a man with a hungry mind who believes that what matters in life is the journey rather than the destination. So to learn more about his journey, let's hitch a ride with, from his home in Malta, Richard England. Richard, welcome to In Conversation.
Welcome. It's a great pleasure to be on this program and also a great honor. So in your good hands, Alastair.
Richard, the pleasure's for us. It's a privilege to have you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Let's just start with something that I was recently told, which is that you and your wife have just been on a cruise. And I want to ask you, how was it?
Well, words fail me to describe it. It was absolutely fantastic. But one of the things, I'll make an observation from an architectural and the designer's point of view. Mm-hmm. My impression of ships which are involved in cruises are that the design is brash, it's overdone, and verging on the kitsch. And this was such a relief to find this wonderful, restrained, beautifully designed ship. And one of the things I must point out is that wayfinding, which is normally so complex on these ships, was so easy. The staff were fantastic, the crew was fantastic, and the cruise director was an absolute fantasy. She's a marvelous woman, plus the fact that she happens to be a wonderful mezzo-soprano, which of course was an actual bonus from my operatic sort of penchant. The wonderful thing was that also, because of the COVID situation, one felt extremely safe, and the health and safety precautions were 100%. And that was extremely necessary, because otherwise one would have felt, I think, a little bit uneasy. But that was perfectly catered for. Also because the ship itself is a sort of post-COVID design, being the latest. Venus is the latest of the great Viking ships. And the other thing which, of course, impressed me was the fact that the library, pictures, there was a cultural overlay, which is normally absent in these type of ships. So what can I say? It was fantastic. My wife, of course, fell in love with the spa, and not to mention the shops, but that's another matter. But basically, it was an absolutely beautiful experience. And because I think the ship is designed, unlike the other ones where more is never enough, I think this was a perfect example of less is more.
Richard, that's lovely to hear, and I mean, I would echo, I think, everything you've said. I mean, I'm not trying to turn this into a marketing exercise, but I find that what is clever about the design of the ship is that even though you may be one of up to 900 people, you never have a sense of being in a crowd. There's the way the spaces work. I mean, there's been times when I've been on the ships and I've thought, well, where is everybody? I mean, what's going on? Is there something that's going on that I don't know about? And that's quite a clever use of space.
Excellent. You still felt an individual as opposed to part of the crowd.
Absolutely. So Richard, great. I'm glad you had a good cruise. Now, you were born in Malta, where you're speaking to us from right now, and you graduated as an architect from the University of Malta, and then you climbed high up the ladder to become not only Malta's leading architect, but acclaimed internationally. And I'd love to hear you just talk a little bit about, if you would, about those early days and how you came by your first architectural commission.
Allow me to add one small thing, just as a sort of biographical note. You see, I belonged to an age when apples and blackberries were fruits, and that gives an idea of my age. And the mouse was a rodent with a long tail. So But despite the fact that I can't stop myself growing old, I struggled all my life, the late period, not to grow up, to preserve part of the child in me as being alive and beating. So, in the words of Michael Ende, who wrote The Never-Ending Story, I believe that man dies when the last part of the child in him becomes an adult. So I struggle very strongly to keep that childhood innocence and enthusiasm burning in my heart and in my soul and in my spirit. My architecture, I started, as you correctly say, studying architecture in Malta. Then there was an opportunity that the world famous Italian architect, Gio Ponti, came to Malta because he had a project. And of course, I jumped on the bandwagon and asked my father, who was an established architect, whether he could ask Ponti if I could actually work in the studio, which in fact materialized. And I worked for 18 months. I learned more in those 18 months, I think, than I learned in my 7 years at the university. And when I came back after 18 months, my father said to me, look, you've done well. You've gone through the whole process, and I have some nice letters from Gio Ponti. And I'm not going to give you money as a present, and I'm not going to give you an object. But some 5 weeks ago, I have had a commission to build a small church in a very small village in the north part of the island called Manicata. 500 inhabitants, all farmers. And he handed me over this commission, which of course was the greatest gift. In a way, it was handing over of the baton. And I started working on this. I was 24 years of age. And my first designs were not very positively met either by the villagers or even less so by the ecclesiastical authorities. Yeah. The aging archbishop, who was in his late 70s, having had one look at this church, said, this is more like a submarine than a church. The villagers themselves, of course, what they really wanted was a larger dome than the dome of the adjacent village. Mine has to be bigger than yours. And so the initial problem was to try and persuade these people to get this project going. But I was extremely lucky because the project was published in the Architectural Review, and this suddenly became a sort of one-upmanship for the villagers. Then, of course, came the problem of setting out this project on this ground and meeting the people of the village who decided they were going to do this on a voluntary basis, which was a wonderful idea. But it had its sort of black spots, because the guy who was leading the group said very humbly, I'm afraid none of us can read. So then came the problem of my having produced all the drawings, and of course nobody could interpret or read these drawings. And when I went up and said, where are the drawings? He said, oh, they're very beautiful, we framed them. I said, they're not meant to be framed, they're meant to be a conversation between the architect and the people who are going to build the building. And basically, one had to go through a process of almost a medieval system of the master mason making the building himself with his own hands. One of the wonderful things was that I learned to make a building with my hands, because making a building is one thing, designing a building is another thing. You design for others to build, but you make with your own hands. And I always say to my students, once in your lifetime, try and make a building with your own hands, even if it happens to be a little room. My whole idea about the church was, how do you produce a church of its time, but also of its place? And the most important thing, it was the time just before Vatican II, and I had already incorporated the idea of the protagonist, the priest, facing the congregation. I was also obsessed by this idea that there was a too clear and vital a division between the congregation and the priest. I wanted to make sure that the congregation were not spectators, but participants. So the whole design of the church was to bring together a sense of unity between participants who are no longer participants, but now are also part, even stronger than that. They belong to the whole, and the church is not a house of God. It's a house for the community. It took 12 years in the making, but in a way it became an iconic church in the sense that it changed the whole aspect of how churches were designed in that particular period. It drew its inspiration from local tool sheds, from the great Neolithic temples, but not something which was copied visually or aesthetically, but from the very feeling. You know, I'm a great believer in the vernacular, which we might talk about later, and how that actually provides a roadmap and routes for an architecture which belongs to its space and belongs most importantly to memory.
Right. You mentioned inspiration for the church. I mean, I was reminded of when I looked at the photographs of the building of one of my favorite artists, the American sculptor Richard Serra. And I think we have a particular image. I think you can see it there on your screen of one of his favorite works of mine. And the way the curves of the church, the building that you designed, so I felt there was a little echo there, but which I found rather pleasing to think about. But I also love the idea of your father just giving you that commission. It's sad he didn't live to see it, did he?
Unfortunately not. The building took 12 years in the making because, again, funds were low and it was done by people who didn't really understand what they were doing, but they did it with great love. Love is a great quality which we seem to have lost in this particular era we're living in. And he died about 3 or 4 years before it was completed, which was, of course, sad. But he had seen it in shell form.
Right. Well, this was, I'm correct in saying this was in the 1960s?
This was between 1964 and 1974.
So, and this was about the time when Malta became independent?
Absolutely.
And I just would love to hear you talk a little bit about how Malta was during the 60s. I mean, did you feel the winds of change blowing across the island? Because the world was going through an enormous amount of upheaval at that time, and I'm wondering how was it in Malta during the 60s?
Well, look, the zeitgeist of the time, and that was a very powerful decade. I think the 60s actually changed the world. It was the first decade where people forgot probably the Second World War. There was all these new movements in art and music, and the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Elvis, and then Bob Dylan and John Baez, and then in classical music, people like Stockhausen, Takemitsu, John Cage, who I had the privilege of, and Steve Wright, and then of course there were the great poets of from California. And these new guys like Corso, Ferlinghetti, favorite Bob Kaufman, who have this wonderful one-liners. I went to a masquerade party disguised as myself. None of my friends recognized me. And that's about the masks we all wear. And then, of course, there were the artists. I mean, there was Warhol, there was Jasper Johns, Rauschenberg. It was a period of tremendous change. Mm-hmm. And, of course, then there was the Vietnam War, there was Kennedy, the assassination, Martin Luther King, flower power. But all of this somehow seemed to reach Malta. So we got something of the zeitgeist of the age. In a way, it created a need for change. With independence in 1964, of course, the Russian was sort of pushed forward. And suddenly there was this urge of a few of us, not many, I would think 10, 15 people, who went to different forms of art, wanted to see something which had its ethnic roots in the island and in the island's history, a sort of mnemonic retention of something, but looking forward but reaching backwards. And so there was Charles Camilleri in music, there was Emvin Cremona in painting, there was Gabriel Caruana, a lot of names anyway. But so we in a way got together, and myself in architecture, of trying to create an art form or a literary work which somehow had its roots, not in a nationalistic way, but in a regionalistic aspect. But then what I found was extremely fascinating for me was that as a young architect, there happened to be in Malta at the time a number of great personalities of great international stature. Basil Spence, the architect of Coventry Cathedral and the British Embassy in Rome, Victor Passmore, the great abstract artist, Ernie Bradford, Anthony Burgess, Nicholas Montserrat, who had written The Cruel Sea and then wrote The Capellan of Malta. And as a young architect, I was architect to all of them, practically all of them. So one went over to, say, Desmond Morris's residence, and there was a problem with a pool or some other architectural problem. 15 minutes to solve the problem, and an hour and a half of a personal masterclass with people of this stature. And that was the most educational period of my life. I'm in my 20s, you absorb and you take this in. And it was a learning curve. And I'm so privileged to say that later on, people like Basil Spence and Victor Passmore became personal friends, but most of all, mentors. And I still feel, even at my old age now, that one needs mentors. One needs to be able to have people who pass over things to you, which they are your peers, but at the same time, they're teaching you. And I always believe that it is important to remain the eternal student.
They must have been really exciting times, Richard. I mean, I'm just very jealous of you. That list of names you just reeled off. There's some people there I would have loved to have met. I mean, Morris in particular, but Passmore as well. And wonderful, wonderful. You mentioned the vernacular, and I know it's important to you. And I just was wondering, how important do you think it is for contemporary modern architecture to respect the vernacular, to not to tread on the past with too heavy a boot, and yet at the same time remain fresh, new, and possibly avant-garde? I mean, in a way, there's almost two things which seem to contradict themselves. But I'm just wondering how you incorporate that sense of the past and the vernacular into your contemporary architecture.
The composer Bela Bartok once said that what is new and significant must of necessity be grafted to old roots. And the old roots are best found in the vernacular. The vernacular is an architecture without architects, sometimes more successful than the architecture with architects. If we remember that the Titanic was built by professionals and the Ark was built by amateurs, we might have an example there. The wonderful thing about the vernacular is, in a way, it was more sustainable and more eco-friendly than all our attempts today. The architecture stemmed from the climate, it stemmed from the necessity of the land, it stemmed from a necessity to love the land because the land produced the crops. So people understood. If you look at a Maltese farmhouse or a tool shed, which you see there, that all the structure is carried out of this one single building material which we have on the island, which is the local limestone, which in fact is the rock itself, which makes up the island. So it's all about a maximum utilization of the very minimal resources. And it becomes a tradition because each generation increases and adds something, and that is why it becomes a very successful tradition. So we need to look back. In fact, one of the greatest books by Bernard Rudowski was Architecture Without Architects. And there he was looking at the very roots of architecture, of the understanding of the site, of the understanding of the materials, of how to cope with climate, how to cope with the possibility of invasion in Malta. Because, you know, and that is one of the, so in fact, it's about, we should use it as a stepping stone. We should use it not to copy the vernacular, but to learn the lessons from the vernacular and to try and adapt them. Architecture today has become about fashion and about shopping. It's no longer what the essence of architecture is really about. Architecture is a servient art. We shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. So we have a very, very heavy onus on our shoulders as architects, because we are producing the environment within which man operates, lives, and hopefully lives happily. Unfortunately, as I think you pointed out, the public at large have fallen out of love with architecture and also consequently with architects, for the very simple reason that I think today most of the buildings are in fact money makers. We live in an age where we know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And that is a great loss. While the people who built the vernacular, the tool sheds and the farmhouses were building to protect themselves in harmony with nature and surroundings and the lifestyle they were living in.
Because a lot of what we think about, Richard, today as great buildings were hugely criticized when they were built, and took a long time before they were liked, admired, appreciated, and accepted. And I mean, I even, you know, apparently the Eiffel Tower was even, you know, a lot of people really disliked it when it was put up and didn't want it to become a permanent feature. And yet now Paris is unimaginable without it. More recently, the pyramid at the Louvre Museum is the glass pyramid, which, I mean, I was in Paris when all the debate was going on. It was under, I think, President Mitterrand, and the whole debate was happening about whether this construction should be made or not. And actually, I was there the other day, and it was at nighttime, and it was rather beautiful. I have to admit, it was rather beautiful. And it in a way, it made the Louvre more beautiful, and the Louvre made this glass pyramid structure more beautiful. Same with Pompidou Center, which is a fantastically popular place for people to visit in Paris. You know, the criticism that was leveled at it when it was constructed back in the 70s was amazing. So I'm just wondering, I mean, has this ever happened to you? Have you built a building and the people have hated it and then come around to like it after?
Look, change is always awkward. People are not very, very prone to accept change, because especially if they're comfortable. So something which is completely different at the beginning jars. Time heals a lot of things.
Yeah.
And eventually people take to, I mean, I.M. Pei's pyramid is an absolute masterpiece. I mean, as you say, the Eiffel Tower, George Bernard Shaw used to say, I would visit Paris and have breakfast on the Eiffel Tower. It's the only place I can't see the damn thing.
Yeah. Yes.
And of course, Renzo Piano, who was a very close friend of mine and who was, of course, responsible for the Malta Parliament here, has always said at the beginning, the building was referred to as a monster. But now it works. So change gives us a different perspective. We learn to live with things and we learn to love them. And I'm sure it must have been exactly the same in the Renaissance with the great buildings of, say, Brunelleschi, or in Florence, or Giotto, or even perhaps the doors of Ghiberti.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. You've talked, Richard, a lot about how architecture, or you've talked and written a lot about how architecture can influence our physical and mental states. The idea that a building, a construction is experienced not just visually, but with all the senses of the body. And what someone I know that we both admire, Gaston Bachelard, the French philosopher, would call the Poetics of Space. Could you expand on that, about how you see spaces as being mood manipulative in a physical and a mental way?
Definitely, space is mood manipulative. You can walk into the great Pantheon in Rome, and there's no doubt about it that you feel that here there is something. I like to term that as atmosphere. But architecture is not only termed and considered and experienced visually, it's experienced by all our senses. We feel architecture, we smell architecture, we hear architecture, we also, of course, see it. But, you know, in one of the most wonderful books exactly on this subject, the Finnish architect and critic Juhani Palasma has a book called The Eyes of the Skin, which is in a way a sort of build-up to the Gaston Bachelard book, which of course is a classic.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that when he was on a visit to the Parthenon, the Acropolis, he had a great urge to taste the marble. I think that must have been a wonderful thing. But, you know, the wonderful thing about atmosphere is if you go to a monastery, there is no doubt that the atmosphere there gives you a sense of peace. There's silence. It's what I call an architecture which cuddles. I'd love this word. If we could produce architecture which, instead of being almost pushing us away, but actually embraces and cuddles us. You know, there's a wonderful story about Jonas Salk. Jonas Salk had troubled himself for years to find the vaccine for polio. And he then went for a 3-week stay at a monastery in Assisi. And he solved the problem there, because he said that the serenity and the peace that he felt within these walls was such that it inspired him. So obviously, space does something. It's how the geography of the space influences the geography of the mind. And it's also about beauty, but beauty is very difficult. It's almost like St. Augustine being asked about time and saying, well, I know what it is, but don't ask me to explain it.
Yes.
I think that's a very tall order. But we sense beauty, not by any monetary terms, but we sense beauty by the heart. We sense beauty by the mind, but mostly by the heart, which reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from one of the books which I consider to be almost a Bible, is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry.
Yes.
What is significant is invisible to the eyes. That which is essential is only approved and sensed by the heart. So it is the heart which we have to appeal to. We have to try and create something which, I mean, Alain de Botton in his book, The Architecture of Happiness, which doesn't go down very well, by the way, with architects for somehow or other, but he does say that a beautiful piece of architecture can uplift your soul. And that's what I try and search in my architecture, an architecture which somehow touches the senses. You know, an Arcadia, a private Arcadia, a sort of middle road between dream and reality. But we need these. We need the fairy tale. When I was working with Gio Ponti, there was this wonderful morning experience. He would come down and recite the Lord's Prayer. And when he said, give us this day and our daily bread, etc., he said, and also give us our daily favor. And I thought that was an absolutely beautiful thing. We need to be able to go back to something which, in fact, because at the end of it all, the onus of the architect is to make the ordinary extraordinary, is to be able to, I believe very much in the words of Tennessee Williams, I don't want reality, I want magic.
Yes, yes.
And Jorge Luis Borges, who remains one of the greatest of, I think, writers, he was blind, and he was once asked, but why do you travel if you are blind? He said, because it is more important to feel a place than to see it. And that is about the atmosphere. That is what a space feeds us back. You know, we have a lot of lessons to learn in this age. We live in an age where we consume a lot, we waste a lot, and architects need to think more of eco than ego. I think architects, I once said that an architect commits suicide by jumping off his own ego.
Is that true?
Well, so I won't be able to prove it, but I'm sure that in some cases it has happened. So the important thing you see is that how we can actually think in terms of how we relate to our planet today. Mm-hmm. We have destroyed the planet. We have destroyed the environment. So everything is measured in monetary terms, and the price of everything is there. But what we need to do is to remember that money-making processes are normally environmentally and socially damaging. We are being irresponsible. We need to pollute less, we need to waste less, and we also need to recycle more. So at the end, we have to remember that possibly the most important thing which we have to do is that we tread gently on our planet. You know, when the last tree is cut down, the last river goes dry, and when the last piece of soil gives us no longer any crops, we will find we cannot eat our money.
Yes, absolutely. That's quite a depressing thought. But maybe I think sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. And that may be partly what we're going through right now. Richard, anybody who knows you, even if it's just for a short time, as I was privileged to do, knows, I would think, would describe you as a very spiritual person. And you've certainly designed a lot of spiritual spaces. Is that something you've sought out, designing spiritual spaces, or does it just sort of come along that way? And how do you incorporate spirituality into a construction?
You're measuring against the immeasurable, which is not an easy task by any means. No. How did that come about? I think possibly because after Magna Carta, which sort of became a sort of iconic thing, many other local parishes asked me to produce buildings, but it's a very tall order. You need to create silence, you need to create serenity, you need to create what I referred to before as a building which cuddles you, which actually makes you feel comfortable. Because I believe prayer at the end is not about asking, but prayer is about listening. So you need a space which is silent. The difficulty is the transition between the secular or the profane and the sacred. So to me, one of perhaps the most important spaces in the design of a sacred space is the threshold. Because the threshold is the in-between. You are neither out and you are neither in. But every religion and every religious building within that religion has got a sacred sort of interval between the profane, the secular, and the sacred. In the Muslim, you wash your feet, and in the Christian, you dip your fingers in holy water. So you need this mental and sort of total concentration that you are going through a great leap. Because at the end of it all, faith is a leap. Faith is a leap. Science teaches us why, where, but, at the end of it all, the big leap is belief. And this is where I think spirituality comes in. So, the idea that we create a space which can generate a sense of somehow coming together with the divine is no easy task.
No.
And simplicity, the elimination of the non-essential. Too many churches today, I find, are far too complex. One of the great masters to me of the design of sacred space was the Mexican architect Luis Barragan. And I had described his architecture as an architecture without adjectives, which is really the complete elimination of the.
Yeah.
At the end, somebody had once written that buildings are also homes for the soul. And I think when we're designing a sacred building, this is what we have to think about. I have a theory about sacred buildings. I mentioned briefly when we spoke about monasteries, that I think it's the amount of love that you put into a building, into the making of a building, and that love and that energy is somehow absorbed by the materials. And those materials in time render back that energy, render back that love to the users of the building. I have always tried, I think, to paraphrase the word of C.S. Lewis. While others were building ships in my bottle, I was attempting to build a lighthouse.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yes, and I love the idea of incorporating love into a building. I was thinking whilst you were saying that, you could probably say the same thing about marriage and relationships in a way. I mean, maybe not quite in the same way, but I think there's definitely a parallel to be drawn there. I was fascinated by this particular project that I was fascinated. I really loved. I don't think it was ever realized, and you can tell us why. It was and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this right, the Filfa Chapel. Filfa Chapel. Yeah, and we have some pictures of it. I mean, it's literally taking spirituality into the earth, and it almost is a kind of land art in a way. I mean, there's this cross we can see. Well, you describe it, Richard. You describe what we're looking at right now.
So the island of Filfa, which is about 5 kilometers off the southern coast of Malta, must have been an altar for the people who built the Neolithic temples. In one particular temple, the axis actually faces the island. And in another, at a certain stage, they actually changed the axis in order to face this iconic altar. So it was in a way a pagan altar. And by the way, these people knew something which somehow we seem to have forgotten. Where has all the wisdom gone, lost in knowledge? These were people who lived in Malta. They came to Malta 5,000 years before Christ, and the civilization finished and vanished. We don't know how and why. 2,500 years before Christ. During that period, they built a series of over 20 sites, probably double sites, where they had temples. We presume they are temples because they left no written word. But they understood that the earth, they could husband the earth, and the earth produced crops, but also that when they planted, when they gathered, and all was related to the movement of the heavenly stars. But the island of Filfa was obviously a pagan island. In the millennium, which everybody was thinking about it being something about change of computers or computers dying down and zeros and whatever. At the end of it all, the millennium was a Christian feast. It was a Christian celebration. It was 2,000 years of the birth of Christ. And I had proposed to the church authorities that we build or excavate more than build this little chapel looking out on the island of Filfla. The island of Filfla then became, because of the cross, because I dug into the earth and opened a window, a much larger cross to relate to the cliff organization and the cliff scale.
Yes.
So in a way, I was Christianizing a pagan altar. And I thought this would have been a very, unfortunately, the authorities did not take very kindly to it, and it remains a project. But you know what the extraordinary thing is? That's a project which has a series of renderings and has a series of photographs, remains more permanent than an architecture which is actually built. Because architecture, despite the fact that many people believe is the most permanent of all the arts, especially in Malta, because we have bastions and fortifications, and because Malta was always a fortress and a sanctuary, so it's a combination of both. So what in fact is the reality is that nobody would touch a Victor Passmore painting, nobody would add a verse to a poem, and nobody would touch a sculpture by Henry Moore or anybody else. But the moment you hand over a piece of architecture to the client, one, you've lost it, and two, the chances are that immediately he changes the color, he opens a few windows, and the thing is completely changed. Now that worries me. When a building is actually demolished, I'm not so concerned. I mean, I have the imagery, but at least it remains intact. And so, because your architectural projects are a little bit like your children, so you don't like people messing around with them.
Well, I was going to ask you. I mean, how hard is it to inverted commas give away a project once it's constructed? Because basically, once the building's up, it then passes into the hands of the client and to do with what they like. And I mean, I remember a friend of mine who was a painter whenever she sold a painting, it was very distressing for her to see the painting leave the studio and end up in someone else's home, even though, unlike what you said with architecture, it wouldn't be, no one was going to alter it, but it was just the letting go of something in which you've poured so much of your soul into.
It's more painful to part with a painting or to part with a drawing, I think, than to part with a piece of architecture. I think you learn to live with that. But as I said before, what is irritating, and I use the word irritating as opposed to a stronger word, is when you see that building being changed. That is, in a way, perhaps I should have used the word painful.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that must be painful. Last year, Richard, and I don't know quite how you found the time because you're an incredibly busy person, but you did find the time to write a book called Lazarus, Prose and Poetry, which I believe I'm right in saying is an exploration of the afterlife. Now, what prompted you to take on such a massive and weighty subject as that?
Well, apart from having had a near-death experience in a botched-up operation many years ago, which is why I probably survived because I was in my 30s, surely Lazarus must be the most frustrating character of the New Testament. He spends 4 days in the afterlife and tells us absolutely nothing. He comes back and he almost vanishes immediately because there's only one reference in the Bible as to his appearance when Mary watches, his sister washes Jesus's feet, and Judas passes a comment that the perfume she's using is in fact equivalent to one year's salary. So they were obviously a very well-off family. But what I try to investigate in prose and poetry is, first of all, what did he experience? And most of all, why does he not tell us anything? Does he not tell us anything because there was nothing, which I don't believe there was? Was it because there was something which was so beautiful and so wonderful that he could not find the words to describe it? Or was it something so horrible that equally he could not find the vocabulary which would be apt to describe the horror? Or was it a divine mandate?
Mm-hmm.
Or was it that memory abates in afterlife?
Gosh, lots of choices. Yeah.
So I sort of go through these and see which of those might have been the alternative. But then the interesting thing about Lazarus is, of course, he was the cause for Jesus's crucifixion. Because when the Pharisees came to the knowledge that now somebody had been raised from the dead, that was a little bit too much. So they decided that now they had to get rid of Jesus. But they also wanted to get rid of Lazarus, because Lazarus was the manifestation of that miracle. So we don't have this in the Bible, but we have it from early Christian writers, that he was put on a rudderless boat and sent out to sea. And by some miracle, he reaches Cyprus, the city of Keton, which today is Larnaca. And in fact, the church in Larnaca is the church of St. Lazarus of the 4 Days. And there he meets St. Paul and St. Barnabas. And meeting St. Paul and St. Barnabas, they actually elect him Bishop of Keton. Now, what is interesting is that in the year 870, the sarcophagus was discovered because there was a fire in the church, and they rescued the sarcophagus, and on it was written, "Friend of Jesus."
Really? Yes.
So
yes.
that's, and of course, then, you know, the book goes on, and is it possible that he was in fact the blessed disciple, and it was not John? Because when Jesus on the cross says to John, "This is your mother, take her to your home," the apostles didn't have homes. They were very poor fishermen.
Yeah.
But Lazarus was a rich man. And in fact, in the gospel, secret gospel of Philip, there's one reference which says that Jesus raised a rich young man from Bethany back to life. So anyway, the book continues, and right. Of course there was the second book, which I've just also published only about a couple of weeks ago, which was published, is the book on Cain.
Right, Cain as in Cain and Abel. Yeah,
Cain as in Cain and Abel. Now Cain again is probably the most fascinating character from the Old Testament. He's the firstborn. He's the first to probably commit incest, but he marries his sister, or wherever the hell she came from. We don't quite know.
Yeah.
He's also the first agriculturalist. Now, this is extremely interesting, because normally we think that the development of man, although this is allegory, of course, it's not an actual real story, but we think of man as being first a roamer and a hunter, and then becoming a settler. But he is actually an agriculturalist. He actually plants, and therefore he's a settler. And more than that, he establishes the norm of property. Now, this is my property, do not tread on it. It's quite possible that one of his aversions to his brother Abel was that his brother's sheep had trampled his crops. Could be a possibility. Now, so he's the first agriculturalist, he's the firstborn, he's the first murderer, because he kills his brother, but he is the first to speak to God. When Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, there's hardly any conversation at all. They're hardly conscious of the sin that they have committed. And even when God gives them clothing, they don't even say any words of thank you or anything. On the other hand, when God punishes Cain and sends him out into the wilderness, and then he becomes a roamer, Cain immediately answers back and says, "Now hold it a little, that's a little bit too much." So in fact, what he's doing is he's uttering the first prayer. So he's the first human being, the firstborn to utter a prayer to God. And God listens to him, because he says, when he tells him, I will be out in the wilderness and whoever finds me will kill me, God says, no, I will put a mark upon you. And the mark is an alchemy of a defensive mark, a protective mark, but also the mark of a sinner. We don't know what that mark was. And then, of course, he's the first architect, because he builds the city of Enoch. And that's more up my street. So that's, and then, of course, what happens with the city of Enoch, because then it's destroyed in the flood. And then the book goes through to see whether we are descendants solely of Seth, or whether there was intermarriage with the lineage of Cainage. And at the end, the book ends on a positive note that Abel is in heaven because he's the first martyr. Cain is in hell because of his sin, but Abel is not 100% content and asks God for permission to go down and redeem his brother. And when he goes down, his brother recognizes him because of the wound he has on his head. And when there's this conversation, he said, did I kill you? Did you kill me? I've forgotten. And in forgiveness comes with forgetfulness. Once you forget, you've forgiven. And that's how the book ends, and he's redeemed.
Richard, no, it's fascinating, and it in a way that was completely unintentional on your part. It beautifully leads me into my next question, because I wanted to talk. We're getting near the end of our time, but I did want to talk to you a little bit about something we both love, and that is opera. And the story you've just told me about Cain, it's made for opera. I mean, it would make a fantastic opera, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But
as long as we have Cain as a tenor.
Yeah. well, tell me, how did you come to opera? Was it something your father loved, or?
I was because regretfully my mother died in childbirth with me, so I was brought up by my father and by my father's mother, my maternal grandmother. And my maternal grandmother was a strict Victorian woman. At the age of 6 and 7, I had to sit down and listen to Dante and Shelley and Shakespeare, and there was no way of getting out of this. But I'm grateful because she planted the seed of all my cultural interests. And of course, one of the things was an old hand-ground gramophone with Caruso records.
Oh, wonderful.
And of course, the voice of Caruso was somehow or other contagious. And from a very early age, I started collecting records going around. Malta, of course, had an opera house at the turn of the last century, and where it was supposed to be almost a stepping stone to La Scala. And a lot of great singers had come to Malta. And of course, records were bought and left probably in some attic or something. Mm-hmm. And I went around and corrected. Eventually, built up now, of course, not only the cylinders and 78s and the LPs and now CDs and whatever, and a collection of about 12,000 records, including what is rated by the BBC as the world's most difficult record to find, the rarest record in opera, which is a record by Giovanni Zenatello, which he recorded 5 titles in 1902, and I found the 5th, one copy, nowhere else. And Zenatello became a very famous Otello. He was also very famous because he founded the Arena di Verona, and he also gave Maria Callas her first big role. So he has a certain status apart from his own singing. The tenor voice somehow, I think, is probably one of the most exciting. It's somehow the sound seems to go into it's almost into one's bones.
Yes.
And the greatest tenors to me remain, of course, Caruso, who remains this sort of, although the recordings, we are not quite sure what the recordings actually capture in terms of the real quality of the voice. Mm-hmm. The most beautiful voice of all was Giuseppe Di Stefano. Mm-hmm. And Mario Lanza, unfortunately, didn't make the best of the vocal qualities he had, but it was a lovely voice. Our own Joseph Kalea today, who I consider probably to be among the top tenors, and who was a great friend of mine, and who at the age of 16 or 17 used to come to my house here to listen to the Golden Age singers.
Oh, how wonderful. Yes, how wonderful.
So, when my family say that I suffer from a disease called tenoritis.
well, there's worse things to suffer from, but yeah. And one last question for you, Richard, is, and you may have answered it without knowing it, just to give me, what would be a dream commission? If I said to you, because I think if I say to you, what's your favorite building, you'll tell me it's the next one. But I would like to know what would be, I mean, how about an opera house? Has anybody ever approached you about designing an opera house? That would be a wonderful commission.
I did 3 projects for theatre in Malta, and I won the 3 competitions, but for political reasons, the projects never developed. Favorite project of the future? I had proposed some time ago for a particular festivity in Malta when the city of Valletta was the cultural city of Europe, that we should build outside Valletta, of course, what I call a project which I termed the Triangle of Peace. One of the things which have always worried me is that most of the wars are almost religious wars, and more ironically, religious wars between the 3 monotheistic religions which believe in the same God. It seems a little bit ironic.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to create a project where you had a mosque, a synagogue, and a Christian chapel with a meeting place in the middle. It wasn't going to unite the 3 monotheistic religions by any means, but it did create at least a floor where there could be a hand of friendship. Now, as my dream project, non-pollutive, necessary in this age where we've completely polluted our planet, is a project where the floor is the earth, the walls are the wind, and the ceiling is the sky.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's just so beautiful. That's a lovely note to end on, Richard. And a huge thank you from me and from on behalf of people watching for joining us now and sharing your rich and deep thoughts with us. It's been a real pleasure. And, you just make me think of W.H. Auden, who well into his 80s, anytime he was at a party, he always said he felt like the youngest person in the room, And I think you make me think of that. And I hope the child within you stays young and healthy for a long time. Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
All the best. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, viewers, for keeping us or giving us your company. I hope you found it insightful and hopefully a little bit entertaining. I thought Richard was a wonderful guest. And until next time, I wish you all well. See you next time.